Mark, thank you very much. It does work better if I actually turn the microphone on. I wish I could say it was some kind of serious technical issue, but nope, I just didn't turn it on. I appreciate Mark letting me know that that we had messed up. So I will quickly repeat that, not the whole diatribe I did about how Loganville is the center of the earth and all of the greater Atlanta area is just a suburb of Atlanta of Loganville. I won't go into all of that, but um, tonight's a little different. We're not doing the traditional Bible study. We've got something a little lighter, kind of holiday oriented in mind. And oh, the boss is here. Y'all tell her I've been good. Okay. Uh, yes, to the whole world. It'll be on YouTube forever, or until they cancel us. Whatever happens first. That'd be kind of cool if we were got canceled by YouTube. I think it'd be. But uh, as I was saying, we will not meet next Wednesday because of 2 Wednesdays in December, and we will 1 week we'll look at Second John, and the next week we'll look at Third John. And again, to answer the question, why aren't we starting with First John? That's because we've already done First John, and if a lot of people want to do it, I have no problem going back after the first of the year and doing First John again. So tonight it's very different, and that is gonna tonight's more of like a little history lesson. We're gonna talk about Thanksgiving. What is Thanksgiving? Where did it come from? Who are these Pilgrim people? Who are these Puritan people? And if time allows, we can move into some Christmas things too. But the emphasis will be on Thanksgiving, and um, I like uh, to put this information out there this time of year because this time of year you it's kind of like everything in our world right now. Everything is in extremes. Absolutely everything. And so when it comes to Thanksgiving, people have pretty much extreme views. And that is, it's this wonderful, gracious, great holiday that, you know, tells about the wonders of our founding as a nation and all these kinds of things. Which, well, no, it isn't. And then on the other hand, you get people, no, this is one of those horrible things about the intrusion of Europeans and the destruction, and nothing good came out of it. And but like most things, well, that's not really true either. Like most items, as I tell my history classes, always let them know, never take single issue people seriously. You just can't, because particularly when it comes to history, when it comes to politics, because things are just more complicated than that. They really are. I mean, people say, pass a law on X. And then you get 10 years down the road and find out that that law created a whole lot more problems than if you'd have just left it alone to start with. I know you see that constantly, don't you? And people are going, well, why do we even have that? Well, they thought it made sense at the time. Nobody really thought it through. Um, so that's what we're going to do. Hopefully, it'll be fun. Now, I've received a not a complaint, a true chastisement. Said if we're going to take questions from the people here, we have to have a microphone because folks can't hear. So tonight, if you have questions, make your way over to the microphone, and make sure that folks, you got to spread out a little bit, give people room to get by. I don't want y'all stumbling all over each other since it's so incredibly crowded. Yeah. Speaking of, don't believe everything you hear on the internet. But right now it's turned off, so I can show you how to turn it on if you want to ask a question, because it is only fair to our folks listening. So, what's that? Oh yeah, it is Connie's mic, by the way. So, if you're afraid of people not socially distancing properly for it, I've got another one of those green things. We'll put. Don't treat it like a lollipop, and you'll be okay. All right. And want to say, and I always get nervous when I give hellos, because then somebody's going to say, "Well, why didn't you say hello to me?" And I'm going to say hello to Ted, Steve's friend, who's listening all the way from where? Michigan. Wow. That's up where it's cold. I've got a brother that lives in Wisconsin, and I tell him, I said, "How in the world do you make it?" He goes, "Heating bills." He said, "Where you live, your heavy bills uh, are in the summer when you're trying to cool stuff off." He said, "Ours is in the winter when we're trying to warm things up." So let's get started with what I've called the real history, sort of, and some of the images of Thanksgiving and Christmas if we get there. Okay? So here we go. We all know the truth, right? And when the Pilgrims first landed, they made great relationships with the local native people out on what is the Massachusetts Peninsula, um, leads out toward Cape Cod, that sort of thing, and they helped them through, and they ended up and had this great party in which they all came together and celebrated Thanksgiving. Right? That's what we've all seen, the Norman Rockwell pictures, all those kinds of things. And that's where we start running into a little problem because that's not what happened. Okay? It makes for a great story, but that's just not what happened. Um, you talk about Thanksgiving. We have to talk about the things that we know. And so we're going to take it from the very beginning all the way up to the point where um, where Thanksgiving finally becomes an actual holiday in America. Anybody know when that was? You can test right off here at the bat. Ooh, cool. It's not when you think it was. So, when did it all start? Has to do with these people called the Pilgrims. Now, a lot of folks get the Pilgrims and the Puritans confused. They were two completely different groups of people, and we'll talk about the two as we go through. The first group, the ones that came over in September, oh, good, I got a historian to help me straighten things out. In September of 1620, you get the small ship called the Mayflower that left Plymouth, England. So you see where some of the names start to show up? You name things after what you're used to. So when they land, they call it Plymouth. So there you go. Small ship carrying 102 passengers. It was an assortment of what are called religious separatists. Those are the Puritans. So you have to explain, well, what is a separatist? Well, a separatist at the time in the 16th, 17th century in England, there was a lot of infighting that had to do with the crown and the Church of England. And the separatists were essentially the people who got fed up with the political involvement of the Church of England. They didn't want to have anything to do with it, because you have to remember when Scotland and so many other portions of Europe became Protestant, England didn't go through a full Protestant Reformation. They got started earlier. And do you remember who started all of that? It's Henry VIII. And you know why Henry VIII broke away from the what at the time I prefer to call the medieval church, because you can call it the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church of today and the Catholic Church of the time period of the Protestant Reformation, really, other than some language, they don't have a lot in common. Indeed, most of the things that the reformers were upset about and wanted changed in the church, most of those have been adopted by the Catholic Church today. So the Catholic Church today is a very different item, and historically it's dishonest to kind of lump them all together. But we're going to use Catholic because that's what people are used to hearing. So, we all know Henry VIII's problem was that he was a great biblical scholar and theologian and understood that there were problems with the theology and the practice and the biblical understanding of the medieval church, and therefore he broke away, right? No. Henry VIII, let me see, words that won't get me in trouble with other people. Henry VIII was just scuzzy. He just was. He was, yeah. When he was young, he was a dirty old man, and he got worse as he got older. And he just decided that the woman that had been pledged to him to create an alliance between England and Spain, she was substantially older than him, and he just didn't like that. He preferred to have a nice young bride, and he needed to know how to get rid of her. And guess what? Well, divorce was forbidden without the specific permission of the Pope, and it just so happens the Pope at that particular time was really close to the Spanish crown, which meant Henry stuck. So what did Henry do? He ignored the Pope, and he just started his own church. And it's the modern day Church of England. And when you take a look at the Church of England, its structure, very similar to the medieval church. They have bishops, they have priests, the language is very similar, the style of worship is very similar, and a lot of the theology is very similar. Well, then you have the Protestant Reformation that happens, and people in England, because of the Protestant Reformation, start reading the Bible, and they discover the same thing that most of the people determined at the time, and that is most of this church stuff you're giving us has absolutely nothing to do with what's in the Bible. And so there were a group of people that were known locally as the Separatists, and they wanted nothing to do with the Church of England. As far as they were concerned, it was just renamed Catholicism. They were teaching the same thing. They were practicing the same thing. The only things that they had really changed was that Anglican priests could get married and they could personally own land. Two things that Catholic priests weren't allowed to do. That was the only thing that was really different. And so when they read Scripture, they wanted something different. And as such, the Separatists started living in their own isolated communities. What happens to people when you start isolating yourself from others? It's not too long before you're seen as a problem. And they were deeply mistreated in England. And so we know at that point they sailed to America to have religious freedom, right? Wrong. They went to Holland. Why did they go to Holland? Because Holland was, to use modern language, be using it inaccurately, but I'll throw it out there because most people understand it, was very liberal. They had a state church. They were primarily Protestant, but quite frankly, the people of Holland really didn't care what you believed, what you practiced. They didn't care. And so they moved to Holland. And they actually, the Separatists, who became known as the Pilgrims, and they were called Pilgrims because what does a pilgrim do? A pilgrim has no home and journeys. So they pick up the name Pilgrim when they go to Holland because they're not from there. And even in Holland, they had a tendency of moving around from place to place. But they had a problem with Holland. The problem with Holland was Holland didn't care what you believed. And if they don't care what they believe, what do you become worried about the most? Because if you're secure in your beliefs, then being in a culture that doesn't really care what you believe isn't a big deal because you're secure in your beliefs. What do you get worried about? Yeah, contamination. In particular, the contamination of your children. And that's what started bothering the Separatists. And that's when they started making plans to go to America. And that's what started their movement, where they ended up on the Mayflower, coming to this country. So it was 102 of them. Only about 40 were actually pilgrims, were actually hardcore separatists. Because the rest of the folks were a combination of the crew, because you had to hire a crew to go, and that was about 20 more people. And then the other roughly 42 folks were primarily people assigned, because these folks were still English citizens. And so the crown assigned soldiers, mercenaries to go with them and protect them, which really wasn't what they did, because these were kind of the dregs of, these are the folks that they were really hoping, let's put them on the ships with those crazy religious people and maybe they'll just die out there somewhere and we won't have to deal with them anymore. That really was the mindset. So they take off, and it took them 66 days. And yes, the the things that you've heard about problems with ships and the storms they faced. Uh, all of that's true. It was a very harrowing, very dangerous, and they were deeply unprepared because these folks, while they had had some success in business in Holland, they were not wealthy. And what money they did have was primarily built on the ship, was spent on the ship, which means when it came to provisions and such, they were they were stocked only for the best case scenario. Well, they ended up being near the tip of Cape Cod, modern day Cape Cod, far north of their intended destination. They expected to be down in New York near the Hudson River because that's where all the people from Holland were. And remember, the Pilgrims did not come here. This is a very important thing. They did not come here to uh, practice their religion freely. They came here for the purpose of everybody doing it their way. Okay? That's why and so they were going to a place where they spoke the same language, they had connections, they knew the culture, and their plan was to take over. Well, they missed it, and they ended up in Massachusetts. And they founded their little village known as Plymouth. Now, winters in New York can be pretty brutal, but you go a little further north, even as short a distance as what, by modern standards, what Cape Cod would be, and the weather gets worse in a hurry. And that first winter was extremely brutal. Indeed, it was so harsh by the time they arrived, which was late in the year. They couldn't plant anything. They initially tried to start making some um, places to stay on land, but the weather was just too harsh. So the vast majority lived on the Mayflower through the winter. And over half of the folks there died. So by the time you get to the spring, you're down to approximately, there's some argument over, it's anywhere from 42 to 58, depending on which historian you read. Needless to say, most of the people are dead. And then come springtime, they've got scurvy, they're malnourished. Very few of them could actually make it from ship to shore and try to do anything. Well, this is when the native population steps in. First of all, they met an individual who's with the Abenaki natives, and he greeted them, spoke in perfect English, because this is 1620. Europeans have been up and down the eastern seaboard at this point by well over 100 years. Most of the native tribes, while the English just speak English and the French speak French and the Spanish speak Spanish, most of the native tribes on the eastern seaboard spoke their language. They spoke two or three other native languages because of their trade, and they had learned English, they learned Spanish, they had learned French. I mean, you go back and look at it, and yeah, we were just dumb. I mean, I don't know how to put it any nicer. The Europeans, we shouldn't have made it. And the only reason the Plymouth colony got up and started was these native groups along that eastern seaboard had been just absolutely decimated by diseases that had come over with Europeans. Uh, when the when the pilgrims landed and started looking at land, they saw perfectly cleared fields. They could see where the forest had been cut back and that the fields had been tilled at one time, but from looking at the state of decay of the fields, they knew that it had been years since anyone had actually plowed them. And they saw that as a sign of God's providence, which is one of those great reasons why when we take something as a sign from above, we're told to test the spirits. That was not a sign from above. We had already slaughtered, almost conservative estimates. By the time the pilgrims show up, the number of Native Americans up and down the eastern seaboard is by approximately half of what it had been at time of European contact. It really was just that overwhelming. There are several records. The Spanish kept more detailed records, but the Spanish have records of when they were coming up out of Florida and looping around through the southeastern United States. They ran across a coalition of tribes known as the Empire of Cofitachequi. And this was a matriarchal culture. They had a queen. She ruled by absolute rule. It was all of North Florida. It was most of South Georgia. It was almost all of South Carolina, up into North Carolina, some over into Alabama. This thing is huge. And the Spanish lived in fear of them because they knew if they ever upset those people, that by raw numbers, they could just wipe them out. So the Spanish leave. And then when the Spanish come back up in that area about 10 years later, all the cities are emptied. And what they did find were human skeletal remains that showed all the indications of smallpox. So it was just passing through and just passing off those diseases, just absolutely wiped out. So that's what they found. And the native groups that were in that portion of what we now call New England very much had an understanding of land, that land is supposed to be used. And just because you're allowed to use land doesn't mean it's yours. It always belongs to the tribe. It always belongs to that particular nation. And so this fellow shows up and says, there's some fields. There's places to build homes. Have at it. Of course, what did the Pilgrims assume that meant? It was theirs now. Okay? Cultures. They're marvelous things. And then shortly after that, he returned and he brought with him the person that most of us know from our legends that we've heard. That's when Squanto shows up, of the Patuxet tribe. And remember, when we use tribe here, tribal is a form of government. It's not. So when you use the word tribe, you are talking the same kind of entity as like a nation. It's just a form of government. It's, we're a representative democracy. You can also have a tribal form of government. So it's not a negative in any way, shape, or form, but unfortunately some people have used it that way. So when Squanto shows up, truly one of the amazing characters in history. I'll watch my time because I'm going to go way too far. And because he had been kidnapped by some English sailors. He had been sold into slavery, treated horribly. Finally, in England, he escaped and got off the ship in London and managed to work his way back to his homeland by being a part of an exploratory expedition. You'd think this guy would hate the English. Well, guess what? He pretty much did. But who else hated the English? The Pilgrims. Even though they were English, they hated the English government. So now you know why they got along great. They all hated the crown. They all hated the Church of England. They were on board with that. And so they came in, and yes, all those stories that you've heard, those are true. You have largely Squanto, who teaches the Pilgrims, who now are virtually starving to death, who at first is bringing them food, and then is actually teaching them how to cultivate corn, how to get sap out of maple trees, how to catch fish in rivers, how to avoid poisonous plants. And the most important thing is, one of the tribes that had not been heavily decimated by disease were the Wampanoags. And it was Squanto who went to the Wampanoags on the Pilgrims' behalf and put together a peace that lasted close to 50 years. and actually ended up being their undoing because they honored, even after the colonials no longer honored that peace, the Wampanoags did because they had promised. And in their culture, you don't break that promise. You just don't. So that turns 1621 into a marvelous year. 1620, horrible. By the time you get to the fall of 1621, life is great. They know how to plant, how to nurture, how to harvest uh, uh, native crops. And so the governor, William Bradford, he organized a celebratory feast and invited their native allies to join them, including the Wampanoag chief, and you all heard his name, Massasoit. Okay, um, and now remember, now that is what is now remembered as America's first Thanksgiving. Although the Pilgrims didn't use that until later, and it probably wasn't actually the first Thanksgiving, but we'll get to that later if we have time. This is why I try not to do lectures too much with my online college students and give them mainly stuff to read, is because I just love the details too much. I can get swamped in a hurry. And it wasn't just a 1 day thing, this was a 3 day celebration. Um, there's no exact uh, record of the menu, but what we do know is that Governor Bradford sent 4 men on what was called a fowling mission in preparation for the event. So, fowling, they're catching what? Birds. They're getting birds. So, was turkey there? Maybe, probably. There were, to this day, there's still a lot of wild turkey in Boston. I've driven through interstates through downtown Boston and seen turkeys wander across the interstate. I mean, it's just they're still in the area, but it also means a host of other as well. The big thing was the Wampanoags arrived with 5 freshly killed deer, and deer was the primary meat. And then the rest of the dishes were used, because remember now, what? Flour and sugar, the traditional English things, that was all eaten while they were trying to survive on the boat through the winter of 1620. So now everything they have are all native foods, native spices, and because we know that they didn't build any ovens, one of the things you can be guaranteed that wasn't a part of the first Thanksgiving celebration was there were no pies, there were no cakes. They didn't have the things they were used to making that. But it became the hallmark, this is it. So the next time, so you would think, this is the first Thanksgiving, so we do it every year since then, right? Wrong. We didn't do it the next year. Nobody knows why they didn't do it in 1622. In 1623, the Pilgrims held their second uh, celebration to mark the end of a long drought. They'd had a long drought that was calling the um, possibility of a meaningful harvest into doubt. And when that came to an end, they had another Thanksgiving. That's what they called it. But, and this is the key, Governor Bradford called for a time of religious fasting followed by celebration. And that's kind of the key element in that establishment of what we call Thanksgiving. It was never about how much you had. It was never about actually having a big meal, because they had very limited food supplies in 1623 because of the drought. But they had Thanksgiving as an act of worshiping God. That's the piece that's different. That's the piece that ought to embarrass the heck out of us as modern Americans. Because what is modern Thanksgiving about? Stuff your face, watch football, and get ready for Black Friday sales. You wonder why people ignore Thanksgiving and go from Halloween straight to Christmas, it's because nobody has an idea as to what Thanksgiving means. So, what happened to it? Well, the reality is, after 1623, it's just sporadically done. It's not very often, but they're always done much like the Pilgrims did it. And that is, there's some great difficulty. Their political leadership calls them to a time of religious observance, primarily fasting and prayer. And then, as God leads them through that time, they follow that with a time of thanksgiving. Oh, we could learn from that. During the American Revolutionary War is when it started coming up. The Continental Congress designated multiple days a year as Thanksgiving because they were all seen in conjunction with advancements they had made in their cause of trying to pursue freedom and become an independent nation. And they all followed times in which the political leaders, and of course, we know from the extreme left of today that there is no Christian element present in the founding of this country. They would have multiple Thanksgivings a year following times at which people were called to dedicate themselves to prayer to God. And that gets overlooked. Your first American, truly United States of America Thanksgiving is called when by whom? Oh, no. First one, 1789. What was happening in 1789? Constitution was going around the former colonies. War's over. The Constitution's been written. It's going to the states, being discussed and voted on for ratification. And Washington specifically issued the first Thanksgiving proclamation by the national government of the United States, in which he called upon, quote, I call upon all Americans to express their gratitude for the happy conclusion to this country's war of independence and to pray to God for the successful ratification of the United States Constitution. There's the first one. It's not an act of Congress. It's not. The president does it. And it's specifically a time. It was not seen as a time to stuff face and play games. But it was specifically a time, first and foremost, to thank God for what they saw as a successful conclusion to what was a very destructive war, and to dedicate themselves to praying that God would give them a government that they could unify themselves under. There's your first true U.S. Thanksgiving. It's got nothing to do with turkey. And many of his successors, primarily John Adams and James Madison, also designated days of Thanksgiving in their presidencies. And those also came at times of facing national crisis. It wasn't just a fall thing. You face national crisis, and so that's what you did. 1817, New York became the first state to officially adopt an annual Thanksgiving holiday. Several states, all northern states, started celebrating shortly thereafter. They all did it on different days. Like I said, the American South did not participate in that tradition. I've tried to track down why, but most historians I've looked at that studies these types of things, no one addresses that. There's a few issues, a few questions raised that largely had to do with the fact that the South, in many locations, the growing season and such that you can harvest in some places year round. And so that clear delineation of we give thanks to God for a successful year and now we're preparing wasn't quite as evident in the American South. But nobody has a real solid answer for that. In 1727, noted magazine editor and prolific writer Sarah Josepha Hale. How many of you have ever heard of Sarah Josepha Hale? Nope. She was a huge author in the 18 teens and 1820s, mainly a magazine editor based out of New York. I'll guarantee everybody here knows by heart one of her writings. She liked to write nursery rhymes, and she wrote, Mary Had a Little Lamb. That was the main thing most people remember her for. But she launched a campaign to establish Thanksgiving as a national holiday. For 36 years, she tried and wrote articles about its importance. She was probably the one that first started kind of stretching the truth about what, because she wanted it to look really good. So she would exaggerate certain elements, and that became the unofficial history that a lot of people were taught is the actual history, in order to get governors to sign on board with it and to she approached presidents, and no one listened until 1863. Abraham Lincoln finally heeded her request in 1863. And you have to remember, in 1863, the American Civil War was a coin toss. I mean, it could have gone any way at any time. And Lincoln proclaimed, there at the height of the Civil War, and this is what he wrote in part in his proclamation entreating all Americans to ask God to, and I quote, commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife now before us, and to bring us together and heal the wounds of this nation. That was the purpose of Thanksgiving. That's not Thanksgiving today, is it? All the times that Thanksgiving came up through up through American history, where Lincoln makes it a national holiday, are at times of incredible trouble, and people are being asked to give thanks to God because of who God is, because only God can give us the solutions to our problems. And we're supposed to go before God, and that act of thanksgiving is thanking God for the healing and the fulfillment that He will bring. Lord, we need a new Thanksgiving. And I mean that in all sincerity. It stayed that way until 1939. And in my opinion, as he did with many things, Franklin Roosevelt messed up Thanksgiving, as he did, I would argue, several other things, because his idea was we need to increase shopping. If we're going to get out of this Great Depression, we need the people to spend the money they don't have. I would have thought that would have given him the first clue that this was maybe chasing the wrong direction. These folks don't have any money. But he wants them to spend what they have. And so he moved it to a week earlier, because Lincoln put it on the last Thursday in November. He moved it a week earlier because that's kind of, particularly in the Northeast, that's when people started buying all their winter supplies and these kinds of things. And he was hoping, and people did not like it. Indeed, it was derisively called Franksgiving. And he met such passionate opposition that in 1941 he reluctantly signed a bill making Thanksgiving the fourth Thursday in November. I got to ton more stuff. Won't get to, but before I move forward, uh, questions, comments. We need to turn on the mic so folks can hear, or you're welcome to sleep right through it. Oh, now if you're gonna, you got to come up here and switch that mic on, because I was not asked to go down to the bottom right there. That little slide. There you go. And that.
So, if I recall, at the first Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, one of the things on the menu was oysters.
Yes, that's one of the and the pilgrims were shocked. They had seen these things and they thought that was just so abnormal it was ridiculous. But it didn't take long after that before they started making oyster stew and all sorts of things. Um, a lot of the Thanksgiving traditions, um, some of them are great. Some of them I have concerns about. Um, Turkey may or may not have been on the original menu. Now it's estimated close to 90% or higher of the American public eat turkey on Thanksgiving. I know I will. I'm going to try something different this year. I haven't run it by Ann yet, but I'm going to do my turkey different this year. Uh, I'm going to do a Duke's mayonnaise turkey. I saw that recipe and oh man, that looks so good. Mayonnaise on it. Uh, but there's been some good things also associated. Thanksgiving has, for some people, become associated with volunteerism, and there are groups that actively go out and you know provide food for the homeless and those kinds of things. Another positive, I think, has been the emphasis placed on family. Um, that Thanksgiving often has in terms of other things, uh, which I understand we won't have it this year because of New York's raw terror concerning COVID. The Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, I've watched that since I was a little kid, and I like having it on in the background while I'm, cooking the turkey and those kinds of things. But my understanding is uh, that won't be around either. Um, you know, Part of what we miss, and it's because Americans don't study their own history. The Pilgrims, they get lumped in with a group of people known as the Puritans. The Pilgrims really were interested in just trying to have a community that was a godly community, that was a saw itself as a light on the hill, that was going to be a witness for Christ in the world. That's one of the reasons that the original Pilgrims were so willing to enter into a relationship with native peoples, because their hope was, even more so than, hey, these people have food and we don't have any. uh, When you read the writings of the early pilgrims, they saw everything was going to be an opportunity to tell people about Jesus. But about 20 years later, there's a big political upheaval in England, and you get the rise of the Puritans. And you have to remember who the Puritans are. The Puritans were English Protestants during the same 16th, 17th century, same as the Pilgrims, that they were going to fix the problems of the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church was too Catholic. The Pilgrims, they became separatists. Say, okay, well, if that's what you want, that's between you and God. We're going to make our own uniquely biblical community. Puritans were very different, and that was by force or by fiat. They didn't care. They were going to change things. And they became very aggressive, leading to an overthrow of the English government for a while, the beheading of a king. And their goal was really to put together a theocratic government. And that is our understanding of God is going to govern everything. And if you are different, you will convert or you will die. One of the things when you study history that doesn't take you very long to figure out, theocracies never work. Theocracies are run by nuts. They just are. And there were enough people unhappy with the English government at the time that really they didn't truly share the theological view of the Puritans, but the Puritans raised meaningful opposition. Well, as that was coming to fruition and the Puritans were starting to gain political traction, they started sending groups to the English colonies to do the same thing. Okay? And it was those groups that as they moved north, most of them were based out of what became Boston. And as they started to move north, they took over the Pilgrims. It was simply a culturation. They just came in, and the Puritans had bigger funding from the English government. The Pilgrims were trying to do this on their own, and they just essentially, the Puritans overwhelmed the Pilgrims and just incorporated them fully. And that's when everything hit the fan. Because, I'm sorry, yep. Oh, you have to turn it on. And then we'll quit in about 10 minutes. It's, yeah, thank you, Andy, if you could.
Okay, so I'm a little confused. So the Puritans did not come over on the Mayflower.
Correct. They were the Pilgrims, the separatists. The Puritans were, what's the best way to, they wanted to take over English church and English government. And
so they came over later?
Just a few years later, they started coming. They're one of the reasons they get mixed up in history is they are developing roughly the same time. But the Pilgrims chose, in England, they were known as separatists. And the separatists chose to develop their own communities when the Puritans wanted to take over and force their theology and their view of Scripture on everyone by force.
Are there any well-known names among the Puritans?
Well, Cromwell's the most well-known in England. Yeah.
But not in America.
In America, it becomes hard. The line becomes blurred because essentially what happens is the Pilgrims in America are all forced to become a part of the Puritans. And so by the time you get to 1640, Pilgrims are under the rule of the Puritans now. And so it just, William Bradford, who was the governor of the Plymouth colony, he personally becomes a Puritan so that he can remain governor. See, that's the thing that changes. Is that now it becomes, see if this sounds familiar, it becomes about politics. It becomes about power groups. And that was really, and it's a shame for the Puritans because one of the things that Puritans understood was personal piety. If you read the prayers, the journals of Puritans, the Valley of Visions, one of my favorite personal books that I use for personal meditation and personal prayer time. And they are just they're a collection of prayers by Puritans. And they're stunning. They're soul stirring. Puritans understood what personal devotion to God was all about. They got that. But then they took that personal devotion and said, if you're not like me, I will force you to become. So the government they put into place became very oppressive, very violent. It's not the Pilgrims, it's the Puritans that by 1675 gives you King Philip's War. That's where they violated all that goodwill and all those treaties that the Pilgrims had negotiated with local native groups, and they're all about controlling the region. That's the Puritans. It's the Puritans that by 1672, 1692, it's the Puritans that you get the Salem witch trials. The Puritans, while their personal piety was absolutely incredible, because they tried to make a government based on their really narrow view of how they understood Scripture, they took seriously that whole thing of, if you don't agree with me, then we cut off your head. If you don't agree with me, you're a criminal. You don't take my... And that's why among the Puritans you have groups that came out of that, like the Quakers, because the Quakers finally just fled. They were terrified because they had slightly different beliefs. Not huge different beliefs, slightly different beliefs. And the Puritans started killing them. I mean, that's how severe their understanding was. They were great on personal piety. Their communal application of their personal piety was an absolute and utter failure. And that's where you start running into problems in that area. So that's a sidelight. It's a distinction that most people don't make. You know, the Pilgrims understood. You know, they didn't understand a lot, but they understood that. They always understood that they were kind of like guests, and so they kept those allegiances with native groups. However, the Puritans, they're there by God's divine right. And that's not your land, that's God's land. And we're the only people who know God. Therefore, whose land is it? It's mine. See, that's the difference. That's, and you want to start taking a look at some of the things that really went wrong. You know, you want to take a look at some of the bad trajectories that have gone through American history. A lot of it's come from the misapplication of that Puritan approach. Even the Puritan emphasis on, good reform. They had a good reform position on work. Work you do for the glory of God. Everybody works. But it didn't take long before Puritans came to understand that, well, we're the representatives of God. Therefore, it's important for you to work for whom? Us. And that's one of the reasons Puritans, when the early Pilgrims, they were okay with indentured servitude, but slavery was a non-issue. Wasn't even talked about. Puritans embraced it like that. Why? Because they've taken that wonderful biblical emphasis on the importance of using your gifts and abilities for the glory of God and daily work, to where they're now the representatives of God. Therefore, you have to work for them. And if you're not willing to, since they are the representatives of God, guess what? They have the right to do in their mind. We have the right to make you. And didn't have an issue with it at all. That was, so Puritanism ended violently and horribly in England, and it ended not as violently here, but most of the Puritan colonies did ultimately fail, and they were ultimately taken over by like the Massachusetts Bay Company, people that were working specifically for the crown, because the religious endeavor just became violent and harsh and horrible. And, it wasn't any better when the crown took it over, but at least then it was violent, horrible, and terrible, and the crown got the money. And it really was. That was the issue. So that's a lot. We're out of time. I hope y'all enjoyed this. There's a lot of other things that we could talk about. Part of the Pilgrim understanding, the Pilgrims were wonderful biblical scholars, and while it's never specifically mentioned, it's believed that the effort toward having these times of Thanksgivings as the Pilgrims understood them really was a reflection of their understanding of the Festival of Booths, Sukkot, the Festival of Sukkot, and so there's all these really cool biblical tie-ins, but most of that disappears because of the failure of the, should we call, the Puritan experiment, where it just went horribly wrong, and then the crown came back in and took over everything. And then from that point forward, it's all driven by the crown. But in many ways, if you stop and look at American history, that was actually a good thing, because then what happened was the Puritans no longer being in political control. And this is one of those things in American history that gets overlooked, because you have this time period where the Puritans really were just horrible. Once everything comes under control of the crown and all of that starts to go away, the Puritans go back to their personal piety. And the Puritans become more reformed. And that's what leads folks like Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, who are these great spiritual leaders. And we could spend a significant time on the Great Awakening, because until it became so politically incorrect to do so, most good American historians, when you wanted to go back and trace what was really what were the true foundational experiences of not the English colonies, but of what became the United States of America, they start with the Great Awakening. Because you take the Great Awakening out of the picture, and we never see ourselves as anything other than subjects to the English crown. It was the spiritual movement of the Great Awakening that said, you as an individual, you have worth. You have value. You're not measured by the crown. What are you measured by? You're measured by the cross. And that changed everything. And would love to talk to you about that sometime. We're out of time. I hope y'all enjoyed the ramblings of a madman concerning Thanksgiving, and that it made some sense. And we'll be back not next week, but the first week in December, where we will look at 2 John. Let us pray. Oh God, we give you thanks for this time together. I thank you for these folks putting up with me and giving me an outlet for just the joy of some of the history of how you have been at work in your world. And if nothing else, this portion of our common history reminds us that it's a fine line that we walk as we seek to live for you in this world, because it is very easy to slip from living for you into living for self. We give you thanks and ask that this Thanksgiving, as we enjoy our modern elements of Thanksgiving, that we really do take time to stop and give you thanks, especially in the midst of this COVID crisis and hostile political season. We need to remember that very first national holiday where President Lincoln called us to turn to you and to seek you so that you may heal all that divides us. We give you thanks. In Christ's name, amen. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.